How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Now it's time for America to bind the wounds of division. Have to get together.
Today on the show, from a rising sea of Republicans to actual rising seas, we examine if the Bay Area is ready.
None of the counties has a comprehensive plan to rezone the area that's going to be underwater.
And experts are here to discuss California's water crisis. Is the state entering a mega drought?
Some of the big reservoirs filled, but not all of them. And our groundwater is still massively overpumped.
But first, shock around the world as global warming denier Donald Trump defeats Secretary Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Activist Bill McKibben and CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, Terry Tamminen, are here to discuss the shifting dynamics in the politics of climate and energy.
There are just a whole host of unfortunate circumstances that I think have shifted even moderate Republicans, not just to the right, but into being climate deniers.
Up next on Climate One. Joining our packed audience at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, we're pleased to have with us two energy experts active in Democratic and Republican circles. Bill McKibben is perhaps America's most visible environmental advocate. In 1989, he wrote The End of Nature, regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change. He founded the grassroots organization 350.org to mobilize people around the world on the need to get off fossil fuels. He worked on the Democratic Party's national platform as a delegate for Bernie Sanders. On the other side of the aisle, Terry Tamminen was chief policy advisor to Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor of California. He has advised Walmart on its energy strategy and a private equity group founded by the veteran of the Wall Street firm Drexel, Burnham and Lambert. He's currently CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. Please welcome them to Climate One. Welcome both. So Bill McKibben, talk to us about climate in this election.
It was a big issue in the primaries, at least on the Democratic side, and it was wonderful to see a high point in the entire climate story politically in this country was when at the first debate they asked people what the most important issue in the world was, and Bernie Sanders forthrightly said climate change, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, which it is. In this general election, truthfully, all issues of substance have disappeared. That's kind of where we are, and there's been nothing else that we've really had any chance to talk about.
Terry Tamminen, in 2008, John McCain and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama basically agreed on climate change, and then there was this big divergence. So how do you see that and where we are in this political season from the Republican side?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for hosting this discussion because it couldn't be more important given, as Bill said, that unfortunately so many other silly things have taken up so much of the national discourse. Even before that, when I was in the cabinet of Governor Schwarzenegger, and by the way, despite the way your introduction characterized me, I'm not really on the other side. I was one of those stealth Democrats in a Republican administration. Yeah. But obviously it wasn't hard to get someone like Arnold, who many people don't consider a Republican, to move in the right direction. But even back then, in 2004-05, we were working with Governor Charlie Crist, a Republican in Florida, and a guy named Marco Rubio, who some of you may have heard of, who at the time was the Speaker of the Assembly, on a climate bill and on climate solutions. And in Florida, they found the same thing that we found in California, was that what was going to be good for the economy, for the environment, was good for the economy. There was a agriculture commissioner by the name of Charles Bronson, who was about as right-wing as you can get somewhere near Attila the Hun, and yet even he loved the idea that you could take agricultural waste and turn that into biofuels. What's unfortunate is by the time we got to 2008, even John McCain, who was very supportive of those kinds of things, not to mention the Marco Rubios of the world, started to back off because they became hostage to the Tea Party and the other extreme right-wingers who not only didn't believe in climate change, but were basically being fossil fueled by the Koch brothers and the denial industry. So it's really sad to see Mitt Romney, even more recently, who was one of the founders of the first major cap and trade systems in the United States for carbon, had to back off and pretend like he didn't really believe that climate was such a big problem. And suddenly decided to join the NRA for some reason. But there's just a whole host of unfortunate circumstances that I think have shifted even moderate Republicans, not just to the right, but into being climate deniers.
Bill McKibben, one reason that politicians don't talk about it a lot is because the conventional wisdom is that voters don't vote on energy and climate. They vote on pocketbook issues, highly charged social issues, that environment ranks low even for Democrats. So therefore, politicians don't talk about it because voters don't vote on those issues.
Yeah, everybody, I mean, that is sometimes the conventional wisdom. I think it's really been upended in the last couple of cycles. If nothing else, it's what young voters are voting on. Often the number one or number two issue that those 18 to 29 or however it is that the pollsters slice them up votes on. And that's beginning to tell on our political system.
Jerry Tamlin, in 2010, then Governor Schwarzenegger successfully ran a campaign against an initiative to kind of undercut California's climate law, and mobilizing the Latino community was instrumental in that vote when California voters overwhelmingly supported California's climate law. So did that lead to lasting involvement in the Latino community in environmental issues in California, or has that faded since?
Well, I'd say it led to lasting engagement by a variety of communities because the fact that most people don't know from that campaign, we were actually losing that because out-of-state oil companies came in and put lots of millions of dollars into ads to try to overturn our Global Warming Solutions Act. And it's always hard for the nonprofits and others who care about these issues to raise enough money to countermand that. And it wasn't until the American Lung Association came in and ran ads about how overturning AB 32 would undermine other environmental laws, your kids would have asthma as a result, that all of a sudden the numbers changed. So what we learned from that was that, of course, everyone cares about their kids, and I'm very glad, by the way, to see some young people here today who are going to be voters in maybe 10 years. Because no matter where you come out on these issues later on in life, it's important to have eco-literacy, environmental literacy, so you can understand these issues and then vote with your pocketbook accordingly. But I think what that campaign in 2010 showed us was that we have to make this relevant to people in the most visceral sense, and that, of course, very often it is the communities of low income or color that are disproportionately impacted because they live downwind of the refineries or they live in other areas that have been more impacted than others.
Up next, we look at California's rising seas. We're joined by J.K. Deneen, a reporter who covers the sizzling property market for the San Francisco Chronicle. Lauren Summers, a reporter covering science for KQED Public Radio News. And Michael Stoll is executive director of the San Francisco Public Press, which devoted an entire issue to rising seas last year. Please welcome them to Climate One. Earlier this year, Wired Magazine produced a video featuring David Behar, the climate program director at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which gives an idea of what sea level rise could look like in the near future. Let's take a listen.
Well, right now what we have is the king tides that happen every year. They're a little higher than what we get for normal high tides. We have an El Nino effect, which involves warming of water, which makes the water higher elevation as well, and then a bit of a low pressure zone with the rain falling, and that allows expansion of the water even still further. As we see the water sloshing over behind us, that's what we're going to see every single day, 2030, 2040, 2050, depending on how climate change and sea level rise go.
So that's David Behar with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, standing right in front of the Commonwealth Club's new building. Lauren Sommer, there's often, he went downtown San Francisco to do that. It's often downtown gets covered. There's a bit of a bias towards downtown San Francisco. So when you're covering this, do you look for downtown San Francisco, or do you think about other areas that might be affected by sea level rise?
I think as journalists, we tend to gravitate towards things that are kind of iconic and symbolic. You know, the Ferry Building sitting right there. Obviously, a huge number of people work in the financial district. So there's a lot of other places around the Bay, though, that I think have become those places as well. I mean, some people might be familiar with, there's a spot of 101 near Mill Valley that gets flooded on a regular basis now. You can pretty reliably go up there and see them shutting down this big bike trail. And the tech companies are another great example that people kind of, see them right on the Bay. So we tend to pick those places because it's something that people can connect to, even if you maybe live across the Bay or in the South Bay or something like that. But it's getting much easier to find those places than it was maybe 5-7 years ago.
J.K. Deneen, obviously tech companies, if not tech employees, are a big part of the downtown market in San Francisco. Is this on their radar at all? Or like, the city's going to solve it. You're running our business. We can't be bothered with something like that.
I mean, I think the tech companies are tenants. And they just go into, whatever space is available. They like large floor plates. They like old buildings, they like brick and mortar. They like tall ceilings. I don't think that in terms of their presence in downtown San Francisco, it's something that they're focused on.
Not at all. Lauren Sommer, when you do a story on this, do you make the climate connection? That is, when you cover king tides or things like that, because a lot of times the extreme weather happens and journalists, weather people are reluctant to make that connection because they'll get attacked. Oh, it's not proven, et cetera. So how do you cover that? Do you actually make that climate tie?
Yeah, in KQED, we've kind of covered climate change as a regular part of our coverage for a long time. So it's always been there. But I think there are things like king tides that we try to cover because it's kind of reminding the Bay Area about what's coming. I mean, this past king tides, which were over the winter, were really interesting because El Nino was in effect, and the warmer water expands. And so you had this added layer of the king tide, which has to do with the gravitational alignment of the Earth and the moon. You had El Nino. If you get a big storm or a windy day, you've got the added level there of the water. So, there's these things that I think help the public understand it's not just about the water slowly rising. You get these events that can be much more problematic.
That's exactly what Superstorm Sandy was. It was a full moon, expanding ocean, high tides, and the New York Stock Exchange closes for 3 days because it's flooded. Michael Stoll, you think that there's something called climate denial light in the Bay Area. Tell us about that.
In some ways, California, Northern California and the Bay Area are an enlightened kind of bubble in terms of acceptance of science. In other ways, there's this sort of strange compartmentalization where our public policies acknowledge the science of climate change and sea level rise in particular, but do basically nothing to shape the shoreline. And that's in part responsible for, or a consequence of, it's kind of hard to tell, the lack of regulation on private property that's happening all across the Bay Area. There are more than 40 cities that touch the Bay in 9 counties, and none of the counties has a comprehensive plan to rezone the area that's going to be underwater, or the area that's most likely to be underwater. We don't know whether it's 3 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. There's different ways of calculating it. All of those are being talked about. And local governments are taking baby steps. By the time San Francisco has a sea level rise plan that actually makes recommendations to do things like put any kind of limits on private development, it'll be 2018. That'll be 3 years after the city started studying this. They could be studying it for another 5-10 years. And meanwhile, this massive wave of development that's happened in the recovery of the economy is going to be a done deal. And you're going to see a lot of development that we are committing to right now that is in what is increasingly becoming known as a danger zone. And local governments and state governments and regional authorities are just now starting to take tentative steps, but there's really no political motivation to do so.
J.K. Dineen, you cover the property market. The property developers think in fairly long-term cycles, but maybe not as long as decades. Is there any awareness that what they're doing now, are they going to, like, once they sell the building, they're out of it, they're on to the next thing, and so the owner is kind of buyer beware?
I mean, I think developers follow government plans. All of the development going on in San Francisco right now is because of neighborhood planning. It's comprehensive EIRs that covered whole neighborhoods, and from that grows crops of buildings. And so, I mean, I as a reporter, I get, hundreds of emails about all kinds of things, almost none about this issue, honestly. And I do think that, to some extent, I'm, hearing from the same people that the Board of Supervisors is hearing from it. They're reacting to their constituents, and the developers are reacting to the politicians, and we're covering the whole story. And climate change, I mean, is sort of this overarching cloud over everything. But in terms of the nitty-gritty and how policy gets made and how plans get developed or rejected occasionally, it's really just kind of like background noise.
Sure, the people who live in the Four Seasons Tower are much more concerned about that new tower in front of them blocking their $1 million views than any potential sea level rise. Lauren Sommer, when you think about issues that get the public or even your editors interested, is it temperature records, fires, seas, drought? Is sea level rise a hard sell as a story because it's kind of so on the horizon?
It's one of those gradual climate stories that, I mean, I cover this regularly. I'm dealing with almost every climate story I do, right? We always say that environmental stories don't break, they ooze, right? And that makes it hard for us to kind of find the news hooks. I mean, once you've done the story of, wow, this is a huge problem for the Bay, what are we building and where are we building it? It is hard to get your editor 6 months later to be interested in the exact same story. So, I mean, I think the policy developments are kind of very incremental, far in between. I was looking at my old stories from 2011, was the last big major kind of policy move around the Bay to figure out when you make planning decisions, how much do you have to think about climate change? I was like Googling that and I had to go way back to find it. So it's a huge challenge, but I think it's one where we need to think about these things in ways that are not just one development that's not in your city, that's across the Bay, that maybe you won't even read that story, right? I mean, this is a Bay-wide problem. Planners are starting to think about it that way. There's definitely a big planning process going on for a regional look at how the Bay is going to adapt, but we're far from a moment where that's actually just a regular story that we can find ways to cover.
Up next, California's water crisis. Is the state entering a mega drought? We have 3 distinguished guests here today to talk about keeping the California economy well hydrated. Noah Diffenbaugh is Associate Professor in the School of Earth Sciences at Stanford and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. Peter Glick is one of the world's foremost authorities on fresh water. He's co-founder and now President Emeritus of the Pacific Institute, a water think tank based in Oakland. Karen Ross is the California Secretary of Food and Agriculture. She grew up as a 4-H kid on a farm in Nebraska and is now responsible for promoting and protecting California's $54 billion agricultural economy. Please welcome them to Climate One. Welcome all of you. Peter Glick, let's begin with you. We had a wet year. Is the drought over?
No. Okay, so we didn't have a wet year, actually. To be specific, we sort of had an average year. And it's been so long since we've had an average year that everybody kind of got excited. But rainfall statewide was a tiny bit below average, wet in the north, dry in the south. The snowpack was a little below average, and it melted really fast. Some of the big reservoirs filled, but not all of them. And our groundwater is still massively overpumped. So by that measure, the drought is not over.
Karen Ross, how is the agricultural sector being affected? Is it hitting the farms, and are we seeing impacts at the grocery store?
Well, yes, it is hitting the farms, and we've commissioned economic impact reports to better understand how farmers are managing their way through this. It's fallowing acres. That's what farmers do because of the water rights system. the water's cut off, and so you fallow acres if you don't have access to groundwater. So we know that last year, as an example, we were short on surface water deliveries by about 8.7 million acre feet. We compensated by pumping 6 million acre feet from the ground, so we were short 2.7 million acre feet, which resulted in over a $2.5 billion economic loss of economic activity that wasn't being generated, 10,500 jobs that were not created as a result of fallowing that kind of acres. So yes, it is hitting the farms, and that's starting to be back to back.
So Peter Glick, do environmentalists and others unfairly criticize agriculture for its perceived high water use?
So I think we're thinking about this the wrong way. California is a great place to grow food. The soils are incredible. The climate at the moment is incredible. There's typically a lot of water. I think we'll always be a big agricultural economy. During the drought, the agricultural sector has done remarkably well. Some economic impact, perhaps some employment impact. Farm prices have been high, food prices have been high, revenue's been pretty good, but partly that's because we're unsustainably overdrafting groundwater. You made the point that we increased groundwater pumping to 6 million acre feet. Well, that's completely unsustainable, and we're seeing groundwater levels drop. We're seeing subsidence in the Central Valley and in the southern San Joaquin. That can't continue. If the drought were to continue, we're going to see fundamental changes in agriculture. We may see some land come out of production permanently. We're already seeing changes in crop type. We're going to see more tension between cities and farms and ecosystems. We can't leave the ecosystems out here. There have been enormous ecosystem impacts of the drought, and that's part of the equation. So the long-term question is, how are we going to balance all of the things we want to do with water with how much water we have?
You mentioned subsidence. I want to roll a clip from KQED. This is Michelle Sneed, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, interviewed on KQED about subsidence, which is the sinking of land in the Central Valley as a result of pumping out groundwater. Let's listen to this clip.
I've been studying land subsidence throughout the West for 20 years, and I've never measured rates like this before.
Over the past 2 decades, the ground in one area has sunk from Sneed's head to her feet. According to NASA, some parts of the Central Valley are now sinking more than 2 inches a month.
We saw that the area being affected by subsidence was enormous, stretching all the way from I-5 to 99. About 1,200 square miles were being affected by subsidence.
That's an area the size of Rhode Island.
That's Michelle Sneed, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Karen Ross, an area the size of Rhode Island sinking as much as 2 inches a month from the pumping of groundwater.
Sure. So there's a couple things I want to say. First off, historically, over time, we have, and it's not just farmers that depend on groundwater. We also have some cities that are 100% dependent on groundwater. We have historically in agriculture relied on groundwater for about 30% of our total needs, which is more sustainable. It's just that in drought time, that is our reservoir. That is supposed to be our buffer to carry us through disastrous drought conditions. And the last few years, we're pumping as high as 60% of our water is coming from that groundwater. I think everyone will acknowledge that that is not sustainable, which is why I was also very engaged in helping to pass the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We cannot continue to do that, and we cannot waste time in putting our basins back into balance and doing that in a very thoughtful kind of way to make sure we have that buffer for future generations.
Noah Diffenbaugh, help us a little bit understand the drought. Is this drought influence amplified by the climate? By climate disruption, climate change?
A substantial number of scientists have asked that question during the drought over the last 4 years, and that's our peer review and publication process is fast enough that we now have certainly a hill coming up to a mountain of papers asking that question, and the preponderance of evidence from those papers from a number of different independent groups is clearly that yes, global warming is influencing what we're experiencing here in California. The primary influence is through temperature. The more heat there is in the atmosphere, the more that draws water out of soils and out of plants. The faster that it melts snowpack, the more that it pushes precipitation towards rain rather than snow, particularly at lower elevations. And we've seen all of those during this drought. And the work that's come out of my lab at Stanford, what we found is that it used to be in California that we pretty much got half wet years and half dry years. We got half warm years and half cool years. And what's happened with the long-term warming of California that's pretty similar to the global warming is now we're getting a warm year pretty much year after year. 80% of the years in the last 2 decades have been warmer than the long-term average. And what that means is that it's like flipping 2 coins, except we've got a precipitation coin that's pretty 50-50, half heads, half tails, and now we've got a temperature coin that's really loaded towards warm conditions. Right? We're getting 8 out of 10 flips are coming up tails, and that means we get 2 tails more often. And what that means when we have low precipitation and high temperature is we're much more likely to get drought, and that's what we're likely to see going forward into the future more and more.